Hello everyone and welcome to discussion on Dipplin's dark secret and the hidden truths of its evolution. And really what Dipplin's going to be getting when it comes to the DLC 2, the Indigo Disc. This is actually being recorded in the same session as the previous Hisuian Samurai Counter TERA raid guide and the Kieran's Dark Future theory video, which should be coming out after this one. So, let's get started talking about our favorite, or at least not favorite, little Apple, the newest member of the Applin family. And that there's a lot of evidence suggesting this thing's gonna get an evolution, namely the fact that the Eviolite actually works on this thing, despite the fact that there is no evolution for it, and not having the Eviolite work on any of the other members of the fully evolved Applin family. For being Kieran's ace Pokemon, receiving a huge amount of focus in the advertisements for the Teal Mask, it's a very underwhelming Pokemon. Even previous Pokemon that receive a lot of promotion when it comes to the pre-release footage, things like Komo-o, Duraludon, and Corviknight back in Generation 7 and Generation 8, even though they're not the greatest, most powerful things in the entire gen, they're decently very prominent. Quite strong heavy hitters that are in the upper echelons of things, even if they aren't the best overall. And Dipplin's just meh. And yet, the Eviolite works on this thing. It, by all accounts, should not be the end stage of things. So, it's going to be getting something. The other also possibility for what happened with Dipplin is that when Kieran gets his hands on the new legendary, or one of the new legendaries for the DLC, it super juices up his team, including the Dipplin especially. But for more details on that, we got that in the Kieran's Dark Future video, which I think you're gonna love. Basically think of it like Mother Beast Lusamine, except you actually get to fight it. But before we get into everything for, against, and speculating on what could potentially be the solution to everything, even if it isn't an evolution, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more, comment below your thoughts on this thing. Do you think Dipplin's gonna get an evolution, like a terraform, or something else altogether? And let's get on with things. So, most obviously starting with the biggest, most glaring part of this entire thing to support Dipplin getting an evolution, the Eviolite works on this thing. The Eviolite works for every Pokemon that has access to an evolution, but there is one caveat for this that we are going to be explaining a little bit later. Even if the Pokemon's evolution requirements are not met presently, it can still receive the benefit. So Pokemon that evolve, say, through friendship or by level, they don't need to have max friendship or have that level in order to receive the benefit of the Eviolite. So long as the evolution exists, the Eviolite works. And that's weird because there doesn't seem to be a Dipplin evolution, but the game is behaving as though there is one, which, given the coding of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, has generally not been up to scratch and has problems, suggests it is something included in the Indigo Disc that they just maybe didn't patch out fully, as there are 3 months between the release of the Indigo Disc and the initial release of the Teal Mask. They probably didn't spend as much time bug fixing on it, and, well, it's getting an evolution anyway, let's just go check that. So, that's a pretty big thing in favor of it. The other part is, as mentioned before, it received a huge amount of focus for the advertising. It was in almost all the trailers for it, and it was one of the first Pokemon actually shown. It was actually the first new Pokemon shown of it. It's Kieran's main Pokemon. It was shown with him in the trailers, it was first showcased with him, and the introduction of it to the players is of course in the battles with Kieran. And like many ace Pokemon, it has been a little bit underwhelming, but unlike many Pokemon that are shown in ads and, initial promotion for things, it is underwhelming. A lot of the Pokemon that are shown in things like the trailers, unless they're, long-time favorites, things like Charizard, Pikachu, Eevee, Pokemon that we already know more or less which way they're leaning on things, they generally tend to be in the above-average class of Pokemon. Again, things like the Corviknight, things like Duraludon as from last gen. There really hasn't been a prominently featured promotion Pokemon that has been the same degree of underwhelming that Dipplin is. And that makes sense if this thing is not the final stage. It would make far more sense for Dipplin to be the average meh middle stage, where it just warms us up, and then in the final battles with Kieran, then he's got whatever Dipplin's fully evolved form is. The Pokemon that is actually good. Because even the other evolutions of Applin, while not the greatest of Pokemon, Appleton and Flapple are both very successful Pokemon. They're relatively strong competitively, or at the very least, good in competitive to a degree, and even actually very useful in terror raids, something Dipplin doesn't have. And that's mostly because Dipplin doesn't really have a great stat line as is. its ability to decrease the evasion of targets, with Super Sweet Syrup decreasing them by 1 stage, lets allies use significantly more powerful moves that are generally not the most accurate, things like Fire Blast, Hurricane, Thunder, Hydro Pump, without needing to risk the chance of missing, and with Syrup Bomb, decreasing the speed of enemies over the course of several turns, makes it very unorthodox help. But they're very out there things that, with the more heavy double focus of the Indigo Disc, does make more sense. And with an evolution, these traits of it could be significantly more prominent, especially with a bit of a reshuffling of its stat line. Or even just an addition to its repertoire, if not an evolution, possibly maybe a special TERA form. But we're going to be saving that speculation for a little bit later on in the video, as there are going to be 3 major sections of this video. So we've really gone over the things that really heavily support the Dipplin evolution. It's underwhelming as is, it's Kieran's ace, despite it being underwhelming, at least as far as aces go. It's a very prominent Pokemon that does not do the things other historic prominent Pokemon have. And then there's the still a Violite problem, which nothing really makes sense about, and is the biggest thing in support of it. But now we'll go into some things that might not be in favor of this thing getting an evolution. Not 100% this evolution debunked, no proof, but things that may suggest what it's not going to be. And this is, it has the same base stat total as the rest of the Apple Fully Evolved family. Base 485 stats, which honestly is fairly low when it comes to most Pokemon these days, as most Pokemon today either tend to be the Route 1 stuff, which has incredibly low base stat lines to begin with, or they're the endgame stuff, which is generally made by Game Freak to have at least a little bit of a competitive eye, and generally has a little bit higher of a base stat total, or even if having a relatively low base stat total, a much better stat efficiency. Something that the Dipplin family as a whole doesn't really have, but its siblings have marginally better stat efficiency. Dipplin itself doesn't really have good stat efficiency. And this leads into one of the issues that an evolution would have. If it received an evolution, it would either simply be a reshuffling of the base stats as is, think in a case like Scyther into Scizor, where its base stat total is 500 as is, it just loses some speed, gains some attack, gains some defense. It doesn't gain an overall stat increase, as we've seen many times before. When they do branched evolutionary families, they keep all members of the branches at the same base stat total. There are 2 sort of exceptions to this, but both of these we're going to go into a little bit later towards the end of this section, about why they are not an actual match for what's going on with Dipplin, and how one of those lines actually holds the key to what I believe is the truth of what Dipplin is going to be receiving. It would be almost like, despite the general acknowledgement that Flareon is the weakest of the EV evolutions, it would be like if they gave Flareon an evolution. Even if it was just a bump in like 10 stat points, it's still an evolution that unbalances the entire family, which wouldn't really make sense. One other thing about Kieran's team that doesn't also add up is Dipplin is not actually his ace. His most powerful Pokemon is, as we generally follow the convention of the series, is the ace. And Kieran's ace, and most powerful Pokemon, is actually his Gliscor. The Dipplin is actually one of his lowest level Pokemon. So, assigning it to be the ace of his team is not exactly correct. It's like saying that Metagross's signature move is Meteor Mash. While it's very heavily associated with it, and for all intents and purposes, it could be considered that, in reality, it isn't. It's just a Pokemon that's very heavily associated with Kieran, despite not actually being his ace. And the Eviolite is also a bit of a tenuous thing at best, because there actually are a number of Pokemon that do not evolve, but do benefit from the Eviolite. The big ones being male Combee and male Salandit. Despite the fact that they simply cannot evolve, they do actually benefit from the Eviolite. This is also a bit of why, before the addition of Ursaluna into the Pokedex, and even with many of the Hisuian Pokemon not in the Pokedex, their pre-evolutions do not benefit from the Eviolite. You cannot use an Ursaring with the Eviolite and have it receive the Eviolite benefits until Ursaluna was proper added to the dex. Things such as Hisuian Quillfish, Hisuian Sliggoo, any Pokemon that is not in the dex presently and its evolution is not in the dex presently, they don't receive a benefit from the Eviolite, because The way the Eviolite works is a Pokemon must be present within the game's Pokedex in order to receive the benefit. Even if an evolution method exists, if that Pokemon does not exist for all intents and purposes within the game, it can't give the Eviolite benefit. This is something that we discovered, of course, when the game first came out, and people were disappointed that Ursaring couldn't get it. Which suggests that Dipplin getting the evolution is potentially a bug. And the reason we know the Eviolite not working on those previous Pokemon wasn't a bug is because they never went and fixed it. Now, yes, the same logic also holds here that with them not having fixed Dipplin having the evolution, the Eviolite work also could suggest that it's not a bug, but it's also a bit less of a concrete evolution confirmed than there is. But it also does support the potential that it is not a terraform interference, as Ogerpon does have a terraform, and Ogerpon does not have the same Eviolite bug problem. So there is something there. What is there, we don't know. The only thing that somewhat suggests that there could potentially be an evolution, at least within the coding, is the internal ID. There's a space between Dipplin and the rest of the Loyal 3. The problem with this is that the internal ID has never been a one-to-one matchup of the actual Pokedex. With the crossover between the Scarlet Paradoxes into the Violet Paradoxes, when Scarlet Violet came out, and still to this day, there are 3 internal ID slots between the 2 of them. And these are not just the regular placeholder grayed out dex entries that are the standard for placeholder dex entries. These were significantly further along, had a more unique icon, and suggest they were removed last minute or altered. But there is no gap between them. There's no Pokemon between the 2 versions Paradoxes in the final game. So you can't take the internal ID to be a one-to-one for the Pokedex, because even going back as far as previous Pokemon games, this is a very common practice of internal ID slots just being vacant. Doesn't mean that there were potential things that were removed and swapped around or placed potentially in the Teal Mask, as there are no 3 dex entry slots after the Violet Paradoxes. Possibly. But they were specifically in the crossover between the Scarlet and Violet Paradoxes. Potentially, they're not the prehistoric Beast Trio, because there was no corresponding group for the future Sword of Justice Trio. So while there is support from things such as the Eviolite being a potential evolution for Dipplin, the internal ID may support that, but it also could just as easily deny it, as if this is something that is exclusively locked into the Indigo Disc, a potential special terraform may be exclusively locked into that, considered a separate Pokemon, for purposes of not letting people glitch their way into having it early, as we do know about the special 19th Terra type, which could have a connection with it. And considering that back in Generation 8, Appleton and Flapple both had a G-Max form, it would complete the family trio of all forms having some special unique generation effect with a potential special terraform. Now, yes, the G-Max forms no longer exist, and while the G-Max forms no longer exist, which does weaken the argument I am trying to make, it may be a bit of a nod to that in some way. But what all of this does mean is Dipplin's kind of a major focus. It's also a little suspicious we haven't seen Dipplin in the Indigo Disc trailers yet. Which leads into, it is getting something. What it is, we don't know. But it is getting something. That's why it's so underwhelming as is. It's deliberately meant to be meh. Something that we are going to be exploring in Kieran's Dark Future, the video we're going to be producing in a few days, that you guys are also going to enjoy. It's got a lot more future DLC things, including future legendaries, the true champion of the BB League, and again, the 5 massive storylines that the Indigo Disc actually has going with it. And potentially even DLC 3 and 4. There is also another sort of this is also just an observation made of the state of how we view Pokemon in general, which I think is some of the hope for wanting a Dipplin evolution. In the modern day, at least when it comes to Pokemon, we are almost pushed into everything's great or everything is bad. Very few Pokemon tend to fall into this just zone of meh. They're either absolute all-stars, gimmicky but you can do stuff with them, or bad. There's very few non-super gimmicky things that might be able to do stuff, but not really reliable to bad. There's nothing in between where it's just, it's not great, it's not bad, but it's really, really hard to use. And that's kind of where Dipplin falls. The Appleton and Flapple have both had great showings when it comes to previous events. Competitively, both were actually quite good, with Flapple being far better for singles, and Appleton being fantastic in Terra raids, as most of your attackers are going to want to be special attackers when it comes to the previous level 7 raids, and Apple Acid is a fantastic move. As well as the fact that we just love Applin, because when we first saw it, this thing was hilarious, and a lot of the novelty and humor that existed within the original trio of the family is something that Dipplin just can't get. As a support Pokemon, Dipplin has a vastly harder time etching its way into people's hearts and minds. This is something that happens with all support Pokemon, as opposed to attackers, where the only way a support Pokemon stands out and really gets memorable by players is if you're a one heck of a support Pokemon. Think stuff like Alchemy, or Whimsicott, or Grimmsnarl, where as support Pokemon, they're so insanely good, even if you don't do doubles, which is what Dipplin is built for, you know they're good, because they're very direct in how their support operates. Especially when it comes to support, there's two kinds of support. There's overt support, things like your screen setters, your debuff users, your team buffers, your weather setters, your terrain setters. And then there is the more disruptive supporters. The status spreaders, a bit mentioned before of the stat debuffers, fake out users, pivots. These are Pokemon that do unorthodox support to weaken the opposing team, as opposed to strengthen your team. When something strengthens your team, that's more memorable. That's more notable. That's stuff that you can more easily identify. Things like Tailwind on Whimsicott, or Light Screen Setting Grimmsnarl, Decorate Alchemy. But when something has debuff options, where it just sits on the side and throws out some status-y status moves and stuff, maybe throws out some debuff moves, they tend to not really get as much of the spotlight, because your attacker is doing its own thing, and you're debuffing them a little, but you're not focusing on your one attacker, and you know that, well, this thing's always keeping it going. The other thing is just doing what it does and weakening stuff. The other thing to, of course, go for the kill shot, but it's not as reliable in planning. If you have a Sun Setter, you're going to be using a Sun Sweeper. But if you're using a, say, Charm user, or you're using a Thunder Wave spreader, you're not always going to go first thought, oh, Thunder Wave, Charm, because it just may not be effective. And that's where Dipplin really falls. It's got really good support kits. Syrup Bomb and the evasion dropping from Super Sweet Syrup is fantastic. But it's a lot more niche, a lot more in the background than something like sending in a Whimsicott, boom, Tailwind, go Burr, and then blasting things with whatever else Whimsicott's got. Or a Grimmsnarl immediately coming in, screens up. Unless something like Incineroar, disruptive support really doesn't stand out to players as notably. And I think that the collective wanting of Dipplin to be better might be somewhat fueling people's wants. I know for me, at least, it's fueling this. Like, it's very weird seeing a relatively meh Pokemon in the present day, because everything today is either great, gimmicky, or bad. And seeing something that just doesn't fit into any of them is weird. We want to fit things into those spots. And now we get to the branched evolutions that, while they do have different stat lines for the end results, they're not really a match for Dipplin. There's only two of them. One of them is a regional variant, Galarian Mr. Mime, Mr. Rhyme, and regular box standard Kanto Mr. Mime. This is not really a branched evolutionary family in the way that things like Bulbapedia or Cerebi present it, where it's one Mime Jr., splits, and then the Mimes. That would imply you have a choice of, at the moment when the Mime Jr. evolves, you can choose whether you want Galarian or Kanto. The reality is that's not how it is, and it's much more of two parallel evolutionary families that don't intersect. Because the only way to get a specific Mr. Mime to go into whichever form you want it to be is actually not keep it in the same game. If you breed a Mime Jr. in Sword and you evolve it there, it'll always evolve into Galarian Mr. Mime unless you're using the Everstone trick, in which case it will never evolve into Galarian Mr. Mime. And the vice versa appears. If you have a Mime Jr. there that will always evolve into a Galarian Mr. Mime, the only way to get that individual to evolve into a Kanto Mr. Mime is put in a game like Legends Arceus, put in a game like PDSP. A game where Galarian Mime doesn't exist. It's not a branched evolution where you get to choose in the same way something like the Eevee family, or the, to a degree, Kirlia family is, where you can choose either Gardevoir or Gallade if it's a male, or something like Slowpoke or Slowking, where you get to choose. It's a lot more like Galarian Slowpoke and Kanto Slowpoke. A Galarian Mime Jr. will, in the same game, never evolve into Cantonian Mr. Mime. And by the same token, a Cantonian Mime Jr. will never evolve into a Galarian Mr. Mime, and as such, a Mr. Rhyme. So, it's not quite a branched evolutionary family. The other one, and this is the one that I actually think Dipplin's got much more in common with, is Shedinja. Because Nincada, Ninjask, and Shedinja are not actually a branched evolutionary family. You have Nincada, which evolves into Ninjask at all times. You never choose to evolve Nincada into Shedinja. Shedinja's an offshoot. It's really more you evolve into Ninjask, and then if there's a free spot, it spits out a Shedinja. This, oddly enough, actually satisfies just about everything we have for the for and against the Dipplin evolution. It's not an evolution in the sense that it would break the established trend of all evolutions being held equal, while also still making an evolution the game and the Eviolite may consider, while the extra internal ID space being filled. Because the only way to get a Shedinja is to have a free spot in your party. In a way, the game may consider that as Ninjask does evolve. Now, we know that Ninjask does not receive the Eviolite back in Generation 8 and in the previous generations, which may be something that does go against this, but it could also be that the way in which they have programmed Dipplin's evolution specifically, or at least the Dipplin evolution specifically, with I will call this hypothetical evolution Shedipplin, just for thoughts, where the way you get Shedipplin is linked exclusively to the Indigo Disc, and they specifically code it in such a way as it exists presently, but you can't actually get it because it's linked to evolving on the Indigo Disc, which could also potentially be a bug in the system. As we said before, the Eviolite working on Dipplin is a bug. Even if Dipplin does have an evolution, the Eviolite should not work unless it has the evolution in the dex, which its evolution is not in the dex presently. So anyway, it is a bug, which we already know, so Eviolite is not really the most stable game coding-wise, which they've had a lot of bugs before. It could always be a bug doing the wrong thing, giving away a secret where they don't want it to be given away yet, or there's something special about Dipplin that allows you to get this offshoot Shedipplin Pokemon, which it is treating as an evolution, even if it is a split secondary individual. And once again, with the focus of the Indigo Disc being double battles, having a Pokemon that is double battle support would make a lot of sense if you have an attacker offshoot that pairs up with it. Essentially, this Shedipplin will be having an ability that works in conjunction with base Dipplin, where maybe it has a more powerful, less accurate move that is also potentially based on speed. As we know from Dipplin, it's two things: evasion dropping and speed dropping. Maybe this Shedipplin capitalizes on either or both of them. Especially considering the Shedinja evolution, it actually has significantly lower stats than the entire Ninjask family. Now, that's also because of its ability Wonder Guard, and I don't think Shedipplin will be getting anything close to that kind of goodness, but it is always a potential idea. But this is all just wild speculation by me at this point. We really don't know what Shedinja, Dipplin, or anything is going to have to do with. And one thing that also does kind of throw a bit of a monkey wrench in this entire gears is with the demo that was unveiled to many high-profile people in the Pokemon community for early access, nothing about Dipplin was mentioned. Now, this could be that they had to sign NDAs where you're not allowed to mention anything about the Dipplin evolution, so there is that as a potentiality. But with all the guys there that were doing stuff, I think it's a bit unlikely that a Dipplin evolution would not have at least come up, and whether they are forced muzzled on it, or it doesn't exist, we won't know until the Indigo Disc comes out. Had to record the entire thing all over again because my mic kind of crapped out. Thank you for watching, everyone. Please don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more, comment below your thoughts, and I will see you guys next time.